Welcome back to another episode of Thespians. And today we have an old friend back on the show, Margaret Edwartowski, and we are going to chat about what it means to be a writer and what it's like writing from the female perspective. But before we dive in, remember to like, comment, subscribe, and just show us a little bit of love, because I've looked at the numbers here. I feel a little sad. I crawl in my bed and sob for a little bit. So if you can if you can give us some love and hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, I would definitely appreciate that. But Margaret, how are you doing on this fine Sunday afternoon?
I'm great, and thanks for having me back. I'm excited.
Yeah, exactly. And, well, because the first time we chatted, we were talking about your time with Second City, and your work as an actress and as a writer, as well as organizing the film festival in Detroit. But what really piqued my interest was the fact that you're a writer. And I wanted to have you come back on because I wanted to talk about what it's like writing from a female perspective, because from my experience, whenever I'm writing stories or scripts or anything like that, whenever I'm writing for a female role, I kind of feel a bit apprehensive, because I'm not entirely sure how to approach females, because because when it comes to writing for females, typically we kind of fall into either one of two stock characters. It's either the straight-laced person who's the voice of reason in a world where men kind of have the right or the privilege to act crazy, or they're usually like the damsel in distress, which would seem to be the majority of what you see in a lot of films and TV shows. Yeah. So I wanted to go ahead and just dive right in. So when we last spoke, like I said, we were chatting about your time with Second City. And when you started out, you were mainly just working with comedic writing, correct?
Well, I started as an actor, got a theater degree, and then I got into Second City, but I had always been a character actor. So comedy or comedic acting was definitely my milieu. But then once you're at Second City, it's funny when you're just an actor, you don't a lot of times don't think about the writing as being your thing. But Second City kind of thrusts you into that, and is really a boot camp, especially for sketch writing, but definitely for building a everyday writing habits, because you just work such an intense amount, and it's great, and you're young, so it's great, but that's what kind of turned the corner for writing for me.
Yeah, and that was interesting, because it was kind of like a sink or swim kind of mentality. It's like you either do this or you don't. Damn if you do, damn if you don't, kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, and it plays to your competitive nature too, because you gotta. I mean, it's definitely much more, from what I've understood, for Saturday Night Live, much more competitive in this aspect. But
yeah,
you have to push your characters and ideas forward to get stuff into the show. And it's definitely like a shots on goal approach, where it's like, okay, those 6 scenes I brought in, none of them landed. Let's try another one. Let's try something new. So you just keep trying.
Yeah, and it kind of reminds me of a story I read about the Pythons when they were writing a sketch, because they would go away, they would write something, and they would come back together, and they would kind of put it to a vote to see which sketches were worth performing. Was it kind of the same environment?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, and I'm sure everybody thinks that their home turf is the best, but Detroit is a specifically wonderful place, and especially at that time, because we were still in a very underdog place, right? You'd spent your whole growing up, every movie is like, oh, we're gonna send them to Detroit, like it's a punishment, So we definitely had that hand in hand through the war kind of vibe, but also we just definitely had a very supportive group that was very much a family. So so there was a lot more of the let me help you get a leg up kind of approach. So there would definitely be like, hey, I know all of your characters. I brought in this scene for that, coach guy you play and that teacher that she plays or whatever. And you would kind of help each other out, because you knew what was on the buffet, so to speak.
So you're in Second City, you're you're writing your first sketch. Can you talk about what was the process like? What was going through your head as you were trying to figure out, what kind of characters am I going to use? What kind of situations am I putting them in? What kind of jokes or where's the punchline gonna enter the scene to kind of let you know, hey, this is the moment where you got to laugh.
Well, the thing that I think is really helpful for an actor making that transition in that Second City realm is you're going to improvise. A lot of times you'll just come in with a scene pitch, like an idea, basically
Okay.
some characters you played or something that you discovered out of a set, because you play a set every night after your shows. And then you come in with that, and then during rehearsals, you can just kind of like riff through it. One of the very first ones that I remember doing was with Larry Joe Campbell, who ended up on According to Jim for a lot of
Mhm.
years, and then Josh Funk, who was a big was running the Second City in LA for a long time. The two of them, and it was this rare thing that like the two of them were big guys. I'm a big gal, so it ended up being this thing that they were my two uncles, and somebody had called me fat, or something happened that was very like about fat, and I came to them and they did hilarious jokes about it or whatever. But it was one of the first times that it had been something that either came out of a set that I did, or that I was the driving force on. And because I had so much respect for these two guys and I was the newbie, like I just felt this pressure to get it right.
Mhm.
And then the director would kind of say, okay, next time you guys go improvise it, try these couple of things. And then they would videotape the shows, and then you would transcribe a copy, and you would do that a few times and sort of marry the best of it together. So it was kind of quilting, right?
Yeah.
So it was I think it's a really healthy way to learn effective scene writing, because you're taking this thing that was this living in the moment thing where
Mhm.
you were playing off of the audience to see how it worked, and then picking the best tried
Well,
out in front of people stuff.
that's fascinating too, because you said that you were working with with two you know with two veterans, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or at least two well established comedians. Um, because in that situation, did you kind of feel like you kind of had to go with whatever they were telling you? So like say for instance, if you were let's just make it simple. If it was like a Thanksgiving dinner and they came back and said, no, you got to change it to like Valentine's Day, that's way more funnier. Did you just acquiesce, or were there times where you're like, I I know what I know what I put down is funny. I want to stick with this because I know I can we can get something out of it. Did that ever
Yeah.
occur?
A lot of times those kinds of changes would come from a director,
Okay.
sometimes from within, but it did take. I think I was probably better at making those adjustments then than I am now, because I was working collaboratively. Because there were so many times, I guess 1,000 times, where I came in with a scene that was like, oh, it's this father and daughter in a sandwich shop, and like you
Mhm.
play it enough times, and the director changes enough, and then it's like they're in a foxhole and they're cousins, like, but it's the same scene, but it's not. I came in with this one. They were building Comerica Park in Detroit, and I came in with this scene about stadium opening day, and it was based off of My Fair Lady, that Ascot opening day thing. It was very like highbrow, thing. And then by the end, once everybody had collaborated, it was this super funky, like Motown, know, very totally different song, but a huge, accomplishment. Like we loved it. The audiences loved it. So it was like, well, I don't care that it wasn't My Fair Lady at that point. Like it worked out. But
Right.
surrender is a big thing in that art form too. Like it's, yes, and you gotta say, well, I had another idea, but we're going with yours.
Yeah, and that's really the crux of collaboration, because not only do you kind of have to you know compromise, but you also have to realize that sometimes if you want something to work, sometimes you got to go with something that may not necessarily be yours.
Yeah, it's ego. The other thing that's tough is like there would be stuff if we would improvise a scene and I would say a line, and then the next night, somebody else would say that same line before I got to it, and they would get a huge laugh, and then you're like, well, you know what, keep it.
Yeah.
But then now my satisfaction is I know I wrote it, like which was a kind of a good bridge for playwriting, because then it was like all the stuff you're giving away, you're not performing any of it, but that satisfaction of like somebody saying my words,
Yeah. So another thing that I'm curious too is because you said that that a lot of the performances were improv, but yet you're writing these sketches. Can you can you talk a little bit about how do you write for improv? It sounds sounds like a contradiction right there, writing for improv, really. But how do you go about doing that?
So improv was the tool to create the scene. So if you go to a Second City main stage show, there will be a sketch show that is written and honed and rehearsed and refined. And then after that, there'll be usually an improvised set. And that's where they mine the material. So it's used as a tool, and different directors use it differently. There's a guy from Toronto, Michael Gelman, who I learned an incredible amount from. And he's a re-improvised guy. So you never like wrote stuff down till the very end, probably. Even then, you just kept playing it and you kept honing it until like you didn't have to memorize lines because you had just re-improvised it so many times, so
fascinating.
Yeah, that's actually how I write books now, in the car alone, playing all the parts because I just keep talking it out to myself.
Okay, so rather than just like rather than just try to develop something new, you kind of take something that's existing and you keep working it over and over again until you've got something down. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. This time when I do the dead parrot sketch, when I go out on stage and pretend to do the dead parrot sketch, the guy's gonna get really mad, and then this is gonna happen. You just keep like, tweaking it, and then once it seems like the best things remain.
Well, let me play devil's advocate here for a second, because because I've never heard of that concept before, improvisation. Would you? I mean, one could look at it and say, well, isn't that kind of lazy, because you're not coming up with anything new? You're just taking the same thing and kind of working it over and over again until until it's kind of reduced to like rote memorization.
Well, and it's funny too, because like so many times that you go out to improvise, there are, doubting Thomases who will never believe that improv is, made up, right? There's so many times like, well, you guys rehearsed that beforehand. No, we didn't. But I think that kind of stuff was usually just when we were like in a process. So there would be times you've opened a show and then you don't rehearse for, depending on the theater, you run that show for 8 months. You're not, getting material. And then there is a rehearsal process of 8 weeks or so where you are mining stuff. So that is the time. And I totally get what you're saying. Like, you're doing something you already know kind of where it's going. It's not true improv, and it isn't. It's kind of workshopping stuff, And sometimes we would do that within the guise of previews and actually put it into the show. So you're sort of like pulling out things and putting new things into the actual show, while it's still running, and people get a cheaper ticket because you're just trying it out,
Right. So again, I'm just playing devil's advocate here. So that would sort of be like almost like a safety net then for the performers, because rather than possibly go with something that may or may not be familiar to everybody, or has the potential to not be as funny as the material that you're familiar with. If you keep going back to this material and keep mining it and reworking it, you kind of know what the end result is going to be. Sort of like an inside joke with the performers, really.
Sure. I mean, and if you think about it, and I'm a little bit talking out of school, but I think that there's elements of this in stand-up, and probably musicians do similar to, of like, we're going to try out something that we're working on. Like, see, fly it up the flagpole kind of thing. The nice thing about that is usually then by the time you get to opening night, it's not like are they gonna buy it? Because you've played it in front of people before, so you have some sense.
Yeah, and that's actually a pretty good analogy about stand-up comedians, because because with stand-up comedians, you're expecting them to do the bits that you love and that you're familiar with, right? So it kind of
Same with a concert. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So in a way, it's part of the repertoire, and it's kind of an expectation where, if they don't perform it, you're just sitting there scratching. Well, what the hell did I just pay all this money for? I came here to see the Dead Parrot sketch, for example.
Well, and one of the things I love when you watch stand-up is when they're workshopping a joke and it goes poorly, and they just straight up say like, "Well, that one's not going in," like, "Well, I tried that one and it failed. Anyway, next thing,"
But at the same time, you don't want to just reduce yourself to just relying on the old bits. Obviously, you want to keep pushing yourself and writing new material. What kind of what inspires you, or what kind of situations or people kind of get the creative juices flowing to where you're like, I think this would make a pretty good sketch, or I think this might make a pretty good story?
Well, it kind of depends on what arena I'm writing in, right? What would inspire me from a sketch perspective versus playwriting versus writing books are all sort of different. But I would say, like, if overall for voice for me, like an approach, I have kind of a like 80% comedic, 20%, a little bit of drama. And then but for me, what I'm really, really drawn to is like authentically human things, especially like vulnerable, real human stuff. I think because me as a performer and a comedian, like I always sort of not aired my dirty laundry, but definitely was like, hey, here's a thing that is super stupid and embarrassing about me. Like that's what you do for comedy. You show like, I have a giant nose and I'll never remember words or whatever your thing is, and kind of capitalize on it. But I think that's what, everyone I know in comedy has a little bit of a geeky side, and part of that is like we learned to be funny as a like coping mechanism, right? Like of not being the beautiful popular. I mean, I'm sure there's beautiful people in comedy, but you get what I'm saying. Like,
yeah. So do you think your acting kind of helps you in writing, or does writing help you as an actor?
I would say the way I use it now is definitely my acting helps my writing. It helps a ton. Like as a novelist, I'm what they call a pantser, fly by the seat of your pants. So I outline, but I don't really have a plan. And that is all from my trusting improv moment, Yeah. And character development too, because I've developed characters on stage live in front of people. Like that, I think has really helped develop characters as a writer too.
Yeah, it's almost like a reflex or muscle memory, because you've done it for so long. It kind of it would feel kind of foreign if it didn't inform your writing. So that actually does lead me into into the next part, because as a female writer, you're coming from your own experiences and you have your own voice when you're telling the story. What kind of perspectives do you as a female writer bring whenever you're developing a character and telling a story, either in plays or novels or in sketches?
Well, it's funny because, this has kind of changed over the years too, as far as, what dynamics between men and women were when I started writing in the 90s versus what they are now, right? So I would say starting out sketch-wise and in my troupe, I've always been sort of tomboyish and like a guy's girl. So within that context, which is predominantly men, I was definitely one of the guys. But still bringing some of the women's perspective. Now I think things have definitely shifted, but I think that what works for me as a woman writer is probably, I think, that women sort of have a good ability to sort of investigate the whole playing field, especially the emotional playing field, and to really get into via whether it's empathy or just really trying to try on the shoes of the characters and the situation, like really be in it, and fully flush out like what everyone is feeling and thinking. But it also, my specific genre for novel writing is contemporary romance, so obviously that comes very much into play there, and there's a whole other, dynamic involved, that I'm still trying to get right.
Yeah. I get that. I get that. So actually, that's a pretty good transition. So do you feel like there are certain genres that that female writers would excel more at than say others?
I would never limit, what I think women could excel in.
Okay. Yeah.
And partly like, not, I couldn't write everything, like I'm not gonna write an action based anything.
Mm-hmm.
I am not a screenwriter of action films, but I'm sure that there's a woman who's great at it, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know that, I don't think I would define specifically. I mean, like, obviously we are pretty good with romantic, oriented things. And there is definitely a really funny annual thing where they share segments of spicy things that guys have written in books that are really terrible. And I can't remember what it's called, but it's like one of the funniest things to read every year. So I think we do excel at that. But I think we're only limited by what anyone's experience is in. And now there's all kinds of, like, there's STEM romance and like, I mean, there's crazy amounts of fantasy writers that are, women, sci-fi, like all the things that people think predominantly are male. There are women killing it,
Yeah. I was just imagining like you just coming out one day and be like, guess what, guys? I wrote a Batman storyline. It's gonna be amazing, and you're gonna love it.
Okay, so here's the thing. I have like zero hot takes except for this one, and it's that I hate Batman. It's like the one thing I absolutely cannot stand. Like,
Really?
I'm a Marvel girl all the way. But
Okay.
yeah, Batman, it's so tedious and it's boring to me, and he's so tortured and it's so dark and everything is just so melodramatic to me. That's my only hot take.
It's like, yeah, it's like, it's just like rich. It's like this rich guy here. He's working out his trauma by dressing up in a costume, and beating up criminals.
That's what I'm saying. Like, but always like, why the voice? Like, why does it have to be so, I don't know. He takes himself too seriously, and I'm a comedian. I can't do that.
Yeah.
I also, I kind of have a beef with DC because I have an obsessive thing about Henry Cavill. Like, he's my everything. And
Yeah.
like, I've tried to watch the Superman movies so many times and I just get really bored because they're just action,
Yeah.
I'm like, how can you bore me with a movie with Henry Cavill though? Like, I don't know.
Well, I was gonna say, like, if you had seen like the most recent Deadpool movie, you probably were like, over the moon with that brief. Oh, okay, never mind.
Oh no, I heard that he's got a great cameo.
Oh, well, I was gonna say, like,
or
if they,
or something.
yeah, it was a cameo. I was gonna say, like, if they ever cast him, like, he'd be perfect as Wolverine if Hugh Jackman says to pack it in.
Well, I'm waiting for Highlander.
But yeah, I mean, with with writing, whether you're male or female, it's just so easy to kind of get lost in the weeds and kind of just mess things up. And I know recently with with the DC movies, it's always been a huge miss, right? They haven't been able to tell the the proper story because these characters are fascinating, really. I mean,
yeah.
And I'll show my colors here. I'm a DC fanboy. I've grown up with DC.
I shit on it.
No. I mean, it's fine. It's fine. I mean, I only got into Marvel, as recently as 2015, really.
Oh wow.
So, like, I had a lot of catching up to do, but
Yeah.
I feel like with DC, as well as like story writing in general, whether it's novels or films, it's just so easy to make write sensational literature, but in the process you lose the story, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, can you talk about that? Kind of offer your take on why that's the case, and if there's any way to remedy that.
Tell me the question again.
So, so with movies and novels these days, they're very sensational, but there's no substance to it.
Mm-hmm.
The bit I guess from a literature standpoint, I guess one could look at the Twilight novels of Stephanie Meyers or 50 Shades of Grey. Like
Mm-hmm.
when you read them, it's all fluff. There's really nothing that you can get from it apart from the fact that these are just a bunch of people who are surprisingly into sadomasochism. And then with film, and then with a lot of films, storyline kind of takes a back seat because it's all about the visual effects. And we used to make fun of those movies a lot back in the day,
Yeah.
especially with the Michael Bay movies. But especially now, when you watch these movies and TV shows, you get this feeling that that there's either no story, or the story is just so generic. You just you kind of wonder why did they just get some sort of monkey to sit down and write it, because it's very much copy
It's
and
an
paste.
AI script, right?
Yeah. So I want to offer you, I want you to maybe talk about this and offer your take as a writer as to if there's any way that can be salvaged, or or if there's a sort of need for writers to kind of sit down and kind of figure out what are the basics of writing a good story before they actually attempt to put anything on screen or on stage, as it were.
I think hearing what you're outlining, the first thing that comes to mind, and this is all in a realm I think about a lot, because most of the art forms that I find myself in are really in more of the accessible and less of the artsy end of things.
Yeah.
So it, first of all, I think it kind of depends on what is your measure of success, right? Because nobody's going to tell Stephanie Meyer, or I can't remember her name, that wrote 50 Shades, E.L. James, like, you're not a success, because they'll be like, hey, look at my bank account, right?
Yeah, hold my beer. Yeah.
Right. I mean, people loved it. We also love McDonald's, right? Like, it's not a steak dinner, but it's delicious, right? So, and I say this as someone who read all of the Twilight novels and all of 50 Shades of Grey. But it's not going to be, Faulkner or Proust, right? Like, it's in its own place. It is successful. I think the thing as a writer, and it depends on what you're writing for, right? So for me right now, I'm writing books. I have to look at so I'm in the contemporary romance or rom-com genre, what is selling, right? And that's one of the things that's really hard as an artist to come around to, right? Because when you're young and you're in your 20s, you're like, I want to write what I'm passionate about. I want to write what inspires me. And it doesn't matter if it sells or not, right? Well, eventually, if you want to be a working artist, it does matter what sells. And you have to look at, what's out there and what people want. The thing we always used to joke about in Second City days, I used to joke about, is I wanted to write, and I used to call it the scene everyone wants to see, right? And what is that thing? Like, what's that magical thing that is the series on Netflix that's like the Bridgerton, or the
it's like the great
thing is.
It's like writers wanting to write the great American novel, right?
Yeah. And so whatever your genre is, you want to like hit it in that place. But how do you know what everybody wants, right? So you have to do this combination of, I think, looking at, okay, this is the market I'm in. This is what everybody wants. I have this idea that fits these things. It has these tropes, which are very popular or whatever. So I'm going to do the best I can at making that thing work. Currently, like, the book that I have coming out this fall is the tropiest story that's already been told. Like, I mean, honestly, you've seen it before. There's a movie. It's like woman gets an inn that is ramshackle and is going to redo it, and there's a hot guy next door. Like, everybody has heard this story before, but for some reason it's been the piece that I've gotten the most. I've like won awards off of it, you know. So so I don't think it's always about, I mean, I do think a hook is important, but I don't think it's about coming up with the world's freshest idea ever, right? I think voice has a lot, that does a lot of the work for you. People, so like people that are Lena Dunham fans or whoever the writer is, they're drawn to that voice, and whatever they come up with, they're still going to follow it because, you know, it speaks to them. So it's look at your market, you write what inspires you if it fits within that, and then, you know, just try to make it the best you can. Otherwise, you know, you're just grasping at straws, trying to get your 50 Shades money, but also be Proust, you know?
Right. And you know, in that sense, you really can't be both, right? I mean, you can't be E.L. James and Proust at the same time. You kind of have to be one or the other.
It's funny with those two examples, though. I'm sure you know this, but that 50 Shades was fanfic of Twilight.
Yeah,
that's how it came about. Yeah,
exactly. But you know, but that's another interesting point too, because you know, because a lot of the movies and TV shows that we've seen, or a lot of the novels that we've read over the past 50 or so years, they're pretty much going back to what we were talking about earlier about re-improv. It's pretty much, you know, the same story that's been that we're familiar with, and then kind of repurposed. And to your point, you know, you're putting your spin, your own voice on it, but it's still the same story that we're familiar with. And it's almost and it's almost like, just watching it, play out, and you're like, oh, I know what's going to happen here. But we're not so much interested in being able to predict what's going to happen next, because we've seen it 1,000 times. It's more of how will so and so react in this case, as opposed to previous iterations where writers have added their own spin on how this person would react in a similar situation.
Yeah, and I think we have in us a natural instinct of where stories are going to go or should go, right? When we're watching or reading or listening to, taking in media.
Yeah.
And then there's like this window of like what the reader or listener will bear, right? Where that's like, okay, that's fresh and I wasn't expecting it, so that's good. Or it went exactly where I thought it was going to go, but that was also satisfying. Or I totally saw that coming.
Yeah.
But if you go outside of that, they're like, absolutely, I do not believe that. 100%, no way would that have ever happened.
Yeah, you kind of tweak it just a little bit, that you make it your own, but it's not too, but it doesn't deviate too far from the
right,
from the story.
Yeah, to be fresh but not unbelievable.
Yeah, exactly. So I do want to talk about your work as a novelist, because I did an interview recently with a writer from California who writes novels and novellas, and he's also dabbled as a playwright as well.
Cool.
Can you talk about what the process is like for you when you're writing a novel? I know it's a very general question, but I kind of want to get your take on it.
Everybody approaches it differently, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like I said, I'm a pantser, so my first draft will often be fairly quick. But right now I had written like 3 or 4 books, and then I would just go to the next one and start writing it. And I hadn't gone back to, sort of hone and
to edit it,
the old ones. So I feel like I've been editing for a couple of years, but so, my approach, and it needs to improve, is usually like that aha moment. And for me, since I'm a romance writer, it's like a meet cute, but I'll have a scene in my head that's like, absolutely have to write that. And then you're like, oh crap, there's got to be like this whole rest of the book. But then I'll probably like jot down an outline and then completely not pay to it as a draft. And I have a critique partner that I work with. So we meet every couple of weeks and share chapters and help each other through both plotting and also like the work on the back end of like, line edit and stuff. And then since I'm self-pub, I will hire an editor to, polish it up before I put a cover on it and put it out myself.
So how long does it normally take for you to work on a draft? Is it just a few weeks or a month or what?
Yeah, I mean, my debut novel that came out this year called Humor Me was probably about a 6-week draft. And that was like in it. Like I was inspired and it went really smoothly. But
Right.
I would say I could normally, draft anywhere between 6 weeks to like 2 or 3 months, depending on how much time I have. Because of course I'm, full-time working elsewhere and writing in my free time. So
what about the editing process when you're going through and kind of figuring out this needs to go, maybe tweak this a little bit, maybe take this out and swap it for this line instead? How long is that process?
yeah. No, because I always equate it like being a pantser editing a book is like being a documentary filmmaker editing my film versus somebody who wrote, a narrative film and everything was planned out. So there's a lot of footage to go through, so to speak.
Yeah.
So my editing process is pretty long. The good news is I'm getting better at making bigger changes, and I'm constantly trying to learn, because I learned to writing 10-page sketches, and now I'm editing 90,000 word books, which is overwhelming. I sometimes can't really see the forest for the trees. I have a lot of respect for people who see structure really well, because that's not a strength for me. I'm definitely a seeing it close up kind of person.
Right. Just get it out there. Just pour it out onto the page.
Me editing reminds me of, out my husband on this. So, and I've seen other people talk about their male spouses specifically, like when you're like, let's clean the house. And like, while I'm like scrubbing the floors and cleaning the toilets and stuff, he'll be like reorganizing, I was going to say CDs, but we don't have those anymore. But you know what I mean? It looked like caught in the weeds on a really specific, not helpful thing. That's kind of me when I'm editing, because I'll be like, oh, you know what? That needs to be fixed. And it doesn't have anything to do with how smooth the plot is or anything like that. It's just like, oh, that is a shiny object.
It's like maybe instead of it being a house from the 1950s, it's a mock Tudor house. Ooh.
Yes, sir. Yes. Like, well, so my whole series is called Detroiters in Love, right? And then I realized that this book I'm editing right now, neither of the characters actually live in Detroit. So I had to change that. And then they were like, not really loving each other very much. I'm like, well, I better change that too. Like, you just.
It's like if James Joyce wrote Dubliners, but none of it was set in Dublin.
Right. And I was literally, and here's the thing, like Detroit doesn't play. You can't claim Detroit if you ain't it. So so that was already going to get me shit. But then I had to, like, for a second I was thinking, well, maybe I'll write a forward saying, well, I'm named this series, but these couple of characters live in a suburb. No.
Yeah.
I had to change it. So I changed it. But
so
then you got to thread it through,
Yeah, because I mean there'll always be these people who like look at it and they're like, yeah,
she don't know.
BS. Yeah.
Exactly.
So were you always interested in writing rom-coms, or was it just something that you kind of just fell into gradually?
It's funny. I started reading romance by accident because I was on like a trip for work and I had read the books I had with me, and I bought this book in the airport, and I was like, oh, there's a kidnapping and it's historical and Scottish. And then I was halfway home and like, oh my gosh, like fanning myself while I was reading it. So, but then that's when I started reading like a ton of this stuff. And then, there's a range of what's out there, right? And in the self-pub world, there were books that you will read that were like, did nobody even like check, like hit spell check? Like, there's stuff that, and so there's definitely like a learning curve. And you look and you're like, I'm a writer. I mean, I think I could do this, And so it was like, this is a medium that I really enjoy reading. I'm going to take my stab, right? And I don't know, it's changing to fiction from like theater and screenwriting was a big adjustment.
So what would you say was the biggest adjustment out of all of them? Really, was it the fact that these works were were not going to be performed like what you would have with sketch writing or playwriting?
It's two things. One, world building, because I just wrote dialogue. That's all I ever wrote, right?
Yeah.
And even stage direction, you sort of like eventually encouraged to write less and less of it and let the director handle that. But the other one was exactly like you said, people reading it like away from you. Like if I was in a show or wrote it, I could sit in the audience and be like, they liked it or they hate it because it's happening right now and they're reacting or they're not. Right. But when those 1-star reviews come through and somebody had read it, in their own home and everybody feels differently, and they're not affected by the people around them, like in a theater, like honest to God, like sometimes you could probably have a show in front of somebody who probably wouldn't have liked it, but if the energy in the house is great, it might make them feel like they had a great experience, so who knows?
Yeah. Well, another thing I want to bring up too is because when you're writing plays or when you're writing sketches, your work is very brief, right? It's not.
Yeah.
You're maybe doing maybe 1 or 2 acts on any given time, but for the most part, it's going to end probably within within like 5 or 6 pages. I mean. What was it a challenge to kind of sit there and trying to like you said kind of create like a world environment for your characters, but was it also difficult to kind of just make it a long book, as it were, kind of stretching it out further and further, because I've been in that position before where I've sat there, I'm like, I don't know what else I can add to that. Like I think 60 I think 25,000 words is all right, but it's like, no, like
for a novella.
But so talk about that, because I can't imagine like at the very beginning that was easy for you.
Honestly, I had the opposite problem, and I still have the opposite problem. My initial drafts are long. They're long. Like everything in the kitchen sink. The first book that I wrote that no one will ever see, the first draft was 140,000 words, and it was not like fantasy. It was a romantic, like contemporary romance. So, but I also didn't know what the industry standard was either. I was just like, I'm gonna sit down and write a book, So, now I know a little bit more of what the market will bear, but I still come out. I mean, most of my first drafts are about 100,000 words still, and then I got to get the scalpel out,
Right. So what would you say was the most important lesson that you learned when when writing novels? Now that you've kind of developed your own voice and you feel comfortable with the characters that you created and the world that they live in, like what have you learned in that time period?
The thing that I'm kind of obsessive about, and I don't know that I'll ever get right, but it's really fascinating to me. Both in theater and in fiction, there is a show don't tell rule, right? Or guideline, whatever.
Yeah.
And it's different in either of those mediums. If I'm writing a play and they say show don't tell, that basically means like don't throw it all in the dialogue, like have some physical things happening on the stage or have some emotion happening on the stage that isn't dialogue. That's not necessarily the case in fiction. And it really threw me off. I was in a critique group and they're like, well, show don't tell. So like put it in, like have her say it. And I was like, that's the opposite of show don't. But what they were really saying, like deep POV has been fascinating and difficult to master as a fiction writer, to be like really within the head of that character, to get rid of all the filter stuff of like she looked and saw and realized, and like that space between the person and what's happening, and just have it be happening. Like that's the thing I feel like I'm constantly relearning every time I write something.
And that's what I find so fascinating, is the fact that that they're using the same terms, but they've got different definitions.
Yeah.
I think the biggest challenge for me is the fact that you never know if you're doing it right. You know what I mean? And I don't know if I don't know if you've had the same problem as well. But when you try to do that show don't tell, you're not entirely sure if you've done it right. And you're not entirely sure if the reader is going to get what you're trying to say.
Yes. Yeah, because I can see it really clearly in my head.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to describe it to you, but you might not see it the way I see it.
Yeah, and then someone reads it and they come up with a different conclusion. You just want to be like, how the hell did you get that? But then,
oh my goodness, yes.
But then
absolutely.
At the same time, it's kind of like, well, they came to that conclusion because you kind of, you're kind of playing around with the words to where that's what they're going. Well, that's another thing too, because I remember it was either a class or a workshop a few years ago, and they were saying, and they were talking about what you were saying about show don't tell, and they were saying, you've got to, you kind of have to word it in a way that to you is going to be quite obvious. You're going to know exactly where it's going, but for the reader, it's pretty vague and ambiguous. So obviously, let's say if Joe Smith read your novel, just the way that you kind of worded the scene, they might come up with a different conclusion than say Anna Smith, who reads the same thing but comes up with something different. Have you heard anything like that on your end? Or?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I think that this is really why all these layers of other people reading your work are so important. Like critique partners, critique groups, beta readers, ARC readers, like getting all of that feedback, because it's such a like solitary art form. And that was the other big shift, is like, I went from theater, which is the ultimate like collaborative, group work thing, to I'm gonna be by myself and write it all alone and no one will see it till it's done. Yeah. And that can be really, I mean, even if, because I have done a lot of 2-man, sketch shows before, and, it's working when both of you are excited and you're making each other laugh, or, like really like, yeah. When you do that alone, there's like what do they call it? Like you're reinforcing your own, you're like in an echo chamber, confirmation bias. So you're like, oh, that was brilliant, but you don't know until somebody else reads it. Actually, my the thing I always go to when I think like I've written something and it's brilliant, I always think of that scene from Christmas Story when the teacher's reading his theme and it's his dream and she's like, A plus. I always think of that for my own stuff.
Yeah, it's kind of like, it's kind of like that kid is like, oh, I've got this great thing I've always wanted, and then everyone's like, yeah, you'll shoot your eye out, kid. I'm like,
right, come with on. A compass in the stock and this thing that tells time, A plus. Yeah,
it's and I think that's kind of inherent in in all of in anybody who writes, whether it's short stories, plays, or novels. It's this idea that what we're doing is going to be the next big work that's going to be part of the Western canon, and people will read it for for generations, and they'll when they want to learn about the human condition or what it means to fall in love, they'll read a Margaret Edwartowski because it just encapsulates what it means to be a human being. But but obviously we always have to do a reality check. I know I had, because because when I submitted work to literary agents, I've always gotten a response back, and I told this to Matthew when we did our interview. But I remember getting the first letter, seeing the email response after a few weeks, and I was like, oh boy, like I bet they were impressed with it. And then
This is it.
Yeah, and they're like,
Yeah.
I'm like, and I even had it planned. I was gonna like march into my boss's office and be like, "So long, bitches." But then,
Right.
but then, like I read it, and they're like, "Dear Mr. Suwant, thank you for your interest, but upon review, we find that your work is not compatible with what we are looking for." And I'm like, ah, shit.
Yeah.
I guess I'm not calling out of work. Like,
Yeah.
After that.
Yeah, I used to going into querying and stuff. I used to think, well, I'm an actor. I've heard no, a billion times, and a lot of times it's like they look you over and say no. That is in a lot of ways worse than we read your manuscript. We don't like it, but nothing prepares you. I mean, you just have, and then eventually like, oh, they said no too. Like, oh, that was a no. Well, I still have a few out there. It is what it is.
I mean, let me ask you this, because you mentioned earlier that you self-publish your works. Do you find that do you find that arena a lot more? What's the best word I want to use? I guess, would you say it's a lot more liberating than having to go through the traditional route of trying to find an agent, or trying to shop it around to different publishers and see if they if they would like to publish your work and market it?
It's the industry has changed so much, and I think one thing first, a real advantage in my genre is that romance is like a hugely successful portion of publishing, and it's like the most readers read this stuff, but the thing about them is they eat books, like they just go through them super fast. And so having as much content available is really kind of their jam. And self-publishing, I mean, romance was really sort of the like trailblazer with self-publishing, because the readership is like there. So some of those old you're just self-publishing or vanity publishing attitudes are a little bit more by the wayside now, which is nice. But for me, I was querying. I came to this stuff as a second or third artistic career, right? So I don't have like decades to find an agent. And it is a very slow process. And it also, like, odds wise, is like any other creative industry, is like buying a lottery ticket. I mean, obviously you put a lot of work behind the lottery ticket.
Yeah.
But there's no guarantee that you're going to get an agent. So I just kind of got like impatient with having my stuff out in the world, or having I had 7 or 8 books finished, written, that weren't, doing anything. And so I had other great people in my writers organization who were self-published, and they were really forthcoming with, a lot of the info. And nowadays, like, you get Atticus or Vellum, right? One of the formatting softwares. You get a decent cover designer and a decent editor. It's not free necessarily,
Right,
but
right.
you can, you can kind of figure it out, and you can learn this stuff very easily. Even, Gen Xer like me can learn this stuff. And then after that, it's all just social media and marketing.
Yeah.
Which is its own,
Yeah, it's a whole new arena right there.
Right.
It's like,
but I just like got on TikTok, like, we'll see. Like, whatever.
So would you say that for a young writer who's like up and coming, and they kind of feel daunted, they feel like the traditional way of trying to get a book published isn't working for them, would you say, like, self-publishing is like the next best thing, or
it's a totally viable option? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, do you think it's still worth trying to go the traditional route of trying to get an agent?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm still trying to get it. Berkeley has their unagented submissions. Of course, I'm gonna send it. I'm gonna send stuff wherever I can, always.
Right.
Because, why ever stop trying? Like, and hybrid is a totally legitimate thing that people do, or people, put whole series out self-pub, and then the right next book hits an agent and they love it and they pick them up, and then that's the next step of their career. Like, there's no reason to stop submitting. You can't, I say the same, I write grants in my day job, and I say the same thing is like, you cannot win the lottery if you don't buy a ticket. So send your shit out. And the other thing I think that a lot of young writers, I know I wasn't young, but I was new, had trouble with is that naked feeling of sending your baby out into the world to someone. Like, obviously you want to be in the right channels, right? Like submitting to agents or in legitimate contests or things that you don't want to just send your book to anyone. But getting past that thing, like, oh God, they're gonna read it, like, yeah, they're gonna read it. Get it in front of as many people as you can,
Yeah, exactly. Because because they're not gonna know what your work is about if you don't show them what it's about, really.
Yeah. It kind of reminds me of when I was in undergrad. The first costume fitting I had in the costume shop at the college, they gave me like a costume, and there was a little room you could go into and change. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna go in there. And this grad student costumer was like, I mean, you can, but I mean, after you do shows for a while, you're not gonna need that. You could just do it right here.
Yeah.
And at the time I was young and I was like, how dare she? That was so mean and blah, blah, blah. But then of course, cut to 15, 20 years later, I was like, can I just just change your clothes in front of anybody? You don't care, So it's the same thing with your writing. It's like, I'm only going to show this to my best friend. And then, down the road, you're like, oh, you want to read it? Yeah, cool. Like, here you go.
Yeah, you kind of have to, it's almost like you just got to escape out of the echo chamber because because you can get as much, praise from everybody that but if these people aren't going to get you to where you need to be, then it's empty calories, so to speak.
You got to build calluses when you learn to play the guitar. So, and you need to have people tell you, like, no, you're not amazing, or you're not as amazing as you think you are. You have some gifts, and here's where it could be better.
Yeah.
I mean, you need to hear it too.
Yeah, I mean, that's why writers need editors, because otherwise everybody would just publish something they think is amazing, but then people look at it and it's like, oh, this is just complete and utter dreck right there.
Yeah.
Well, Margaret, I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your day to be on this to be on this episode. Yeah, I actually learned a lot. When it comes to writing. If people want to learn more about your work, or if they want to check out your book, where can they go?
So my pen name is Maggie Elliott, Eliot, just one L and one T. And my website is just www.maggieelliott.com. And so my books are on there. And I'm also on TikTok under author Maggie Elliott. I'm on Instagram under author Maggie Elliott, Facebook. I just started a Threads. Like, I'm the social media. I get around on social media. Let's put it that way.
Now, just out of curiosity, why did you choose Maggie Elliott?
Well, I saw a thing that said choose a pen name that is close enough to your own that you would answer to it. So I have been called Maggie by people before, so that was easy. And then I wrote years ago a jukebox musical about Cass Elliott, Mama Cass, and played her. So that was sort of a nod to her.
Gotcha. That's what I always found so fascinating is that writers sometimes they kind of have like a nom de plume, as it were, to kind of create like a separate identity, and I think it's just part of the whole idea of creating characters that you kind of develop a reflex for it. So it's like, if I can develop characters for all these other people, why don't I develop one for myself?
Well, there was a couple, like, first of all, Edwartowski doesn't really, like, you don't see that on a lot of book covers. You know what I mean? Like, it's not a real sellable name.
That's what I was gonna say. Like, it's a very unique name. Like, why not run with it?
But then the other thing is, my books have a little bit of spice, and my day job is in the nonprofit sector working with youth. So I really don't want to have those overlap much. So.
Well, I was just imagining, like, as you said that, I was like, Maggie Elliott, went to, grew up in, the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and she went to Columbia, but she developed a love for writing. She dropped out her sophomore year to devote herself to writing, and
Yes.
she currently lives in an island off the coast of Michigan, not far from Ann Arbor.
Yeah.
You know,
Island near Ann Arbor. That would be amazing.
I was gonna say like that. No, I would love to see you like just write a whole like fake autobiography.
Oh,
about
fake
Maggie
self. I
Elliott.
know. Well, and that's the weird thing, when you're established as an artist in your community under a name, and then you take on a pen name,
Yeah.
and then even today I was like, well, I mean, me as this actor performer who also writes books.
Yeah.
So which am I? Who am I today?
I know.
I'm my authentic self for you.
Like I said, if you do write like a fake autobiography of Maggie Elliott, I would love to read it.
Okay.
I'm just because now I just can't get it out of my head that
A writing prompt, right?
Exactly. I can't get out of my head now that Maggie Elliott, was an Ivy Leaguer who decided, this is not for me.
Who worked with the Peace Corps for 3 years, right?
it's like she developed her love for the romance novels, during a trip to Bulgaria, where she managed to find a nearly ruined copy of Lancelot and Guinevere, and that sort of launched her into the process
Lady
of writing.
Chatterley's lover, right?
Exactly. It's like after a semester at Oxford, she made a pilgrimage to D.H. Lawrence's house, where she developed an affinity for Lady Chatterley's lover.
Yeah, and for the huntsman, or what, a gameskeeper or whatever, right? Yeah.
You got to write it now, Margaret, because I really want to read it.
The queue is pretty long. The terrible thing is I'm in the editing trenches for a couple of books, because I have one coming out hopefully November and then January.
Mhm.
But I have all of these, they call them plot bunnies, but I have all of these things that I'm like just burning up wanting to write. But it's like my dad didn't let us open the new bag of chips till we finished the old one. You know what I'm saying? Like I gotta finish these projects first. So
Yeah.
no Maggie Elliott book until 2026 probably.
Well, I'll be on the lookout for it, because I'm just dying to see what sort of backstory kind of led Maggie Elliott to write rom-coms. But I just want to thank you for taking time to be on this podcast. I just want to thank everybody for taking time and watching. And and if you're enjoying it, please remember to drop a like and subscribe. And as always, get you on the next one.